I always thought moving to a small town would be like stepping into one of those quaint postcards, friendly neighbors, peaceful streets, and a place where everyone knew your name. After the chaos of the city, I needed that simplicity, and Wexley Hollow seemed perfect. Its population barely scraped past 200, and the rental prices were too good to resist. But something felt off almost immediately. It started with the rules. The landlord handed me a worn pamphlet the day I moved in, titled, "Welcome to Wexley Hollow." Below the cheerful heading was a list of instructions. Most of them were harmless. No loud music after 8 p.m. Please lock your doors at night. Standard small town stuff. But as I read further, the rules became strange. 1. Never leave your house after midnight. 2. Do not respond if someone knocks on your door between 12 o'clock a.m. and 3 o'clock a.m. 3. If you hear crying outside, close your curtains immediately. I laughed at the absurdity, assuming it was some local legend meant to scare outsiders, and crumpled the pamphlet into the trash. That night, I found out they weren't joking. 1:37 a.m. I woke up to the sound of soft, steady knocking. At first, I thought it was a dream. The rhythm was too deliberate, too calm, like someone was waiting, expecting. I stayed in bed, heart pounding, as the knocks persisted for what felt like hours. I was too afraid to even check the peephole, afraid of what I might see. The next morning, I mentioned it to Mr. Gilmore, the elderly man who lived next door. His face turned pale. "You opened the door," he whispered. "No," I replied, shaking my head. "Of course not." "Good," he said, visibly relieved. "Remember the rules. There are things out here that don't care for visitors." I laughed awkwardly, thinking he was trying to scare me. He didn't laugh back. The nights that followed were eerily quiet, at least until 3 days later when I heard it, the faint sound of someone crying outside. It wasn't hysterical sobbing. It was restrained and mournful, a soft weeping that seemed to drift from one end of the street to the other. My chest tightened as I remembered the third rule. Curiosity itched at my mind, but dread kept me frozen. Against my better judgment, I peeked out through the corner of my bedroom window, carefully avoiding the full view. What I saw chilled me. A woman was standing in the middle of the street, her back to my house. She wore a tattered dress that fluttered in an invisible wind. Her hair was damp and clung to her shoulders. Something about the way she stood was wrong. Her head was tilted unnaturally, almost like it might snap off her neck. I slammed the curtains shut, barely stifling a scream. The crying stopped. Then came the sound of footsteps on my porch. A town of secrets. The next morning, I tried to leave town. My car wouldn't start, and neither would the 3 I saw parked outside the general store. When I walked into the store to ask about repairs, everyone in the room stopped and stared. It wasn't anger or curiosity in their eyes. It was pity. "You're new," the cashier said, her voice low. "I'm leaving," I snapped, annoyed by the town's cryptic warnings. She shook her head. "You don't leave Wexley Hollow." "What are you talking about?" "Of course I can." Her hand shot out and gripped mine. It was cold, like touching a corpse. "Listen to me. You stay in your house at night. You keep the curtains closed. You survive." I yanked my hand back and left, but her words clawed at my mind all day. That night, just as the clock struck midnight, I heard something new: laughter. It was light and airy, as though several children were running through the street, playing a game. I buried my head under the covers, willing the sound to stop, but it grew louder and closer. Then came the giggling inside my house. I didn't sleep that night. By sunrise, I was exhausted and terrified. Desperate for answers, I returned to Mr. Gilmore's house. He sighed deeply when I told him what happened. "You ignored the warnings, didn't you?" "I didn't do anything," I shouted. "You're still here," he said grimly. "That's enough to attract them." He leaned closer, his milky eyes almost pleading. Whatever you do, no matter what you hear, do not break the final rule. What rule? I asked, trembling. The one we never write down, he whispered. Never, ever acknowledge them. Not by word, not by sight. They're jealous things, you see, and once they know you've noticed them. He trailed off and pointed to the woods at the edge of town. His meaning was clear. That night I didn't sleep again. The knocking returned, louder and more insistent, and the giggling turned to low, guttural whispers. I barricaded myself in my room, refusing to respond, even as the voices began calling my name. The door rattled, the voices screamed, and then it stopped. It's been 3 weeks and I still can't leave. I've tried every road, every path through the forest, but they always lead me back here. The townspeople don't talk to me anymore. They don't even look at me. Last night, I found something strange under my bed, the crumpled pamphlet. It was blank, except for one sentence scrawled in uneven letters. Breaking the rules isn't the problem. It's surviving after you do. I don't know what's worse, the fact that I'm trapped here or the knowledge that every night they are watching me. The first time I truly encountered one of them, it was worse than anything I'd imagined. I'd grown bolder, or maybe just desperate. Another sleepless night had stretched long and unbearable, and as the knocking resumed at my front door, I thought, I have to know. If these creatures were real, if they were behind everything happening in this cursed town, perhaps understanding them was the first step to escaping. Carefully, I crept downstairs, the ancient wood creaking beneath my bare feet. The knocking stopped when I reached the last step. I stood frozen, staring at the door. My hand twitched at my side, instinctively drawn to the doorknob, but my mind screamed, "Don't." Instead, I leaned forward, pressing my ear against the cool wood. Silence. But then, just as I started to pull back, I heard it. A low whisper, soft and serpentine, slithering through the wood grain as though someone or something was pressed against the other side. "We see you." The whisper wasn't just a sound. It burrowed into my head, slick and alive, unraveling a thread of sanity as it hissed. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over myself, and in the fleeting instant my gaze brushed the frosted glass window in the door, I saw it. A shadow, but not a shadow like any human should cast. Its arms were too long, stretching unnaturally wide across the glass like dark tree branches. Its head, I couldn't make sense of it. It rippled and twisted, constantly shifting, never settling on one form. Eyes appeared and vanished. Lips stretched open but formed no recognizable face. My stomach churned while rising in my throat. Every cell in my body screamed to look away, to stop acknowledging it, but I was paralyzed. The shadow tilted its head, and for a moment, I swear it grinned. The knocking resumed, harder, faster, like a thunderstorm in my skull. The sound came from everywhere. The front door, the windows, the walls, like it was inside my house, battering every surface. I clamped my hands over my ears and backed away, tripping over the couch. Then I heard its voice again. "Come outside. We just want to see you." The words slithered down my spine, cold and invasive, but I forced myself to stand. My body screamed to run upstairs, to bury myself under blankets like a child warding off monsters, but part of me, a reckless, terrified part, glanced back toward the door. The shadow was gone, and in its place, standing perfectly still on my porch, was me. A reflection, a copy. I stared at the figure, breathless and horrified, as it lifted one finger and pressed it against the glass. Slowly, it smiled. "See, we're friends now." What it wanted the next morning, I awoke on the floor, every muscle stiff, my mind sluggish as though I'd been drugged. I couldn't remember falling asleep, but the memories of that thing, of me, lingered sharp as broken glass. I avoided the door for days after that, but the encounters only got worse. Wherever I looked, I caught glimpses of them. Dark shapes crouched at the edge of my vision, twisted faces in reflective surfaces, sounds that mimicked voices I recognized. One night, while brushing my teeth, I looked into the mirror and saw a version of myself that shouldn't exist. My reflection stood completely still while I leaned forward. Its face stared back at me, mouth split open in a grotesque smile that stretched to its ears. I smashed the mirror, but for hours afterward, I swore I could hear it laughing. When they break in, there was no stopping them when they decided to enter my house. At first, they came at night, slipping through cracks in the walls or under doors. Sometimes they appeared as shadows, long and fluid, crawling across the ceiling with too many legs. Other times, they were solid, taking shapes that were almost human but wrong in crucial ways, missing eyes, reversed limbs, a neck that bent backward as though snapped. They would watch me, unmoving, their faces expressionless, or worse, smiling. Once I locked myself in the closet, trembling as their voices filled the room outside. They sounded like people I'd once known, calling for me, begging for help. But it was their tones that betrayed them, too perfect, too steady, as though reciting lines from a script. One of them got bold. The door trembled violently before splitting open with a sickening crack. It bent its head sideways to fit through the gap, long fingers curling around the splintered edges. Its skin shimmered, shifting between darkness and translucence, its face blurry as though underwater. It leaned closer, and I almost gagged at the cold, metallic smell wafting off its skin. "We told you not to notice us," it said in my own voice. That was the last thing I heard before blacking out. What happens when you let them in? They never stop once you notice them. The pamphlet should have included that rule, the real rule. Once you encounter them, once you look and listen, they become attached to you, weaving their way into your reality. Now, the night doesn't matter. They come whenever they want. They sit at the foot of my bed while I pretend to sleep. They knock on doors that shouldn't exist and carve symbols into the walls with clawed fingers. They know me. And worst of all, I'm starting to forget who I was before Wexley Hollow. My thoughts slip away more often now, replaced with whispers, ideas that don't feel like mine. Maybe that's how they win, not by terror or violence, but by erasing you one piece at a time until you become one of them.